about dynamic reserves and changes in operational reserves. And we have kind of a diverse panel that's going to talk about different aspects of reserves. A little bit about who I am and why I'm here. I'm Jimmy Nelson. I'm a director at E3 Energy and Environmental Economics. We're a consulting firm that does a lot of work in the US and Canada across 5 offices, and have about 100 plus consultants working on energy transition issues. We focus a lot on kind of the economics of decarbonization, work with regulators to kind of help set policy targets and really kind of crunch the numbers on renewable integration and decarbonization. And so I work on a combination of system planning and system operations. And in the system operations kind of hat that I wear, I work on, I guess, 2 different thrusts: production cost modeling, and usually in the context of reserves. So kind of what's the cost to provide operational reserves, and what's the value of batteries providing reserves. And then I also work on our dynamic reserve tool, which is called Reserve. We weren't super creative with that name, but it produces kind of probabilistic levels of uncertainty that could be used by a grid operator to understand, at 95% confidence, how high or low might your solar and wind and load go, or net load. So that's kind of why I'm here on facilitating a panel on dynamic operating reserves. I guess I've been interested in reserves for about 10 years, back in, say, 2014, when California was really gearing up to add more renewables to the system. The policymakers were making kind of lofty goals of 33% or 50% renewable. And the ISO was kind of saying, well, we don't know if we can operate the grid. And one of the kind of the crux of their issue, or their issues, largely centered around operating reserves and how to meet those, as well as the evening ramp. So that got me thinking about, how do you need to change operating reserves going forward to enable renewables and keep the lights on? And I think that's a topic a lot of folks here think about in depth, especially the folks on the panel. So our panel today is kind of a survey of advancements that are going on in the reserve world in kind of different dimensions. I think the reserve world has come a long way from being a pretty niche field in, say, 2014 when I started, to really having a lot of folks putting a lot of thought and effort into making operational reserves work. So we're going to start out with kind of a market design question, where we have Hoai and Ulrik from Vietnam and Denmark, respectively, looking at kind of the best market design for the Vietnamese grid as it adds more renewable energy. And then we'll have the other 3 panelists will kind of go into more of the dynamism of how reserve requirements might change in space or in time. So Christine and Giancarlo will talk about more of the kind of spatial or temporal aspect, where you're adjusting your reserve need for balancing reserves up or down over time based on the level of risk that you would have in the system. So the goal is to kind of maintain reliability, but also keep costs low, which is kind of a traditional goal in the operating reserve world. And then Frankie will talk about kind of dynamic reserves in space for contingency reserves. So we have kind of an interesting blending of space and time, which is one of those things we always have to think about in power systems, is the combination of those 2 things to get us kind of into the 4th dimension. So a little bit on structure. The panelists will have about 13 minutes each, though the combined Vietnam Denmark presentation counts as 2, so they'll get 26. And then I'll ask a couple of cross-cutting questions that I think all the panelists will have hopefully an interesting answer to, but a quick one. And then we'll turn it over to Q&A from the audience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ulrik and Hoai.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ulrik, and I will, with my partner in crime here, try to give a presentation on the secondary reserve procurement in Denmark and Vietnam. We have a cooperation going on between the Danish and the Vietnamese TSO on how to procure secondary reserves. Just a short, okay, are you operating there? Yes, thank you. My name is Ulrik. I'm trained as economist. I've been working with power system economics and European markets for nearly 20 years. I've not worked that much with reserves. It's more the day-ahead market, design of day-ahead market in a lot of aspects. Also regulatory issues, environmental climate regulation, and so on. Having a close contact these days also with regulators on how to design markets, how to operate markets in Europe, and mainly the day-ahead market.
All right. Is this working? Yes. So my name is Hoai. I'm from Vietnam. I'm from the companies which called National Power System and Market Operations Company. My company is we are TSO in Vietnam. So my job right now is I am the lead of the forecasting team, renewable energy forecasting team. So I am the guy who do the forecasting. I am the guy who does the software, the solutions for Vietnamese system operator to operate the system with much more renewable energy. So now I'm going to give you a comparison between the Vietnam and Denmark. You may ask why we do the slide today together. Because Energinet and my company, NSMO, we have something called TSO partnership, which is funded by Danish government. So whenever we have an issues, we can talk together very fast, and we have a lot of collaboration together. So today we will talk about the study, just two company of us, two TSO in different countries. We did the study together. So today we talk about the study we have done. So firstly, I give you an overview about the comparisons of Vietnam and Denmark power system. So on the left-hand side, you see that is a Danish power system is including two parts, which one D1K, DK1 and DK2. DK1 which is connected to European continental network, and DK2 which is connected to Nordic network. And so DK1 and DK2 is connected together by a HVDC for 400 kV transmission line with around 32 kilometers. And Vietnam, on the left-hand side, we have S-curve, that is the center of the country. Vietnam is quite crowded country in terms of the power system. We are at the side of the Nordic system. So in the northern part of Vietnam, we have a lot of hydro plants, very big hydro plants, and the load area in the southern areas. And in this area, we also have renewable energies. So later on, I will talk more detail. All right, just it's not working. All right, now we compare the system. Denmark power system is just quite a small country, so Denmark power system is not very big. Vietnam is not a big country, but we are very crowded country. We have the populations of almost 100 million, which is 13 in the world right now. In terms of the power system, we are in number 21 in the world right now. So its total capacity of all kind of generation is 86 gigawatts. Our big node is 48 gigawatts. Compared with Denmark, just 18 gigawatts, and big node is 6.5 gigawatts. But okay, regarding the power system, as I mentioned before, for Vietnamese power system, we are a standalone power system, meaning to say that we do not have the AC connection with other country. We are standalone. We have some power chain with China, with now in Cambodia, but we are standalone. And we have three regions: northern, central, and the south, which connected by 500 kV spectrum transmission line. For the Denmark, just highly interconnected with other countries, because they have HVDC, AC, HVDC connection with the Nordics and with continental Europe. Regarding the bidding zones for the markets right now, Vietnam, we just have the generation markets. We have only one bidding zones compared with Denmark. You have two bidding zones, DK1 and DK2. Regarding the renewable energies, in here I would like to highlight this. We have 28% of installed capacity. Right now, our installed capacity is 85 gigawatts, but renewable energy is 21 gigawatts. The story of renewable energy developments in Vietnam is something just remarkable. Let's say that in 2018, we have zero of renewable energies, but only in 3 years, we have 21 gigawatts of renewable energies, including wind, solar farm, and solar rooftop. So just a very fast development of renewable energy. So for the operation coming years, we face a lot of challenge. Just later on, I will explain more.
Okay, if we zoom in on the topic for today, which is the secondary reserve. First of all, the study and the question was a comparison about sequentially procured reserves or co-optimization with the day-ahead market. If we look at the Danish case, firstly, in the middle, we had the day-ahead market, and it's the main market in Denmark as such. We heard, I think it was yesterday, that around in Europe, 30% of all electricity was traded on the day-ahead market. Actually, if we look into Denmark and the Nordics, it's close to 100%. So the day-ahead market is the main market for electricity trade in the Nordics. As we do have a sequential setup and we would like to have reserves moving into the operational phase, we are procuring the reserves before the day-ahead market, mainly. The tertiary reserves, which is the manual FFR and the automatic FFR, secondary reserves, and also what's called the first reserves, which is procured before the day-ahead market. So it's a sequential setup, so to speak. And after the day-ahead market, if needed, we have the energy activation markets, which is the yellow markets to the right. Activation markets is also or are just about to become European-wide as well. The day-ahead market, as we had explained yesterday, and also the intraday market, is a European-wide market where Finland and Portugal is as closely connected as eastern and western part of Denmark, basically. But the energy activation market and the market for reserves is not that mature yet compared to the day-ahead market. But that's one of the goals for Europe, that we move into fully integrated markets in all time frames, as we say. But we keep the sequential setup in Europe. I don't think there's any plans. There may be some considerations, but there's no firm plans on moving into a co-optimization. If we look at the core characteristics of the secondary reserves and also the tertiary reserves, the secondary reserve is a fast reserve that has to deliver what is actuated within 5 minutes. It's the purpose, as you may know, as experts in reserves, is to restore or to maintain the frequency, and also the activation is basically done automatically. It's a signal from the TSO to the market players, the balance responsible parties. The auctions, the procurement of the reserve is a daily auction for all 24 hours. And the energy activation is something that comes later, and we apply what we call the Picasso platform. Picasso is just a name for a piece of IT system, just as Euphemia is for the day-ahead market. I think there was an explanation yesterday on Euphemia and XBIT. Is that right? It's just IT system actually being provided by Inside in Europe, and Picasso is just an IT system where you can do the activation. And the activation is based on the mirror order dispatch approach, Whether it's a merit order or not, we don't know because it bids. But to that degree, we do have a competitive market. We cannot expect that to be a merit order. The tertiary reserve is the slow reserves, which have to be fully up to speed within 12 minutes. Actually, in Denmark, we have a philosophy which we call a proactive balancing. Means that even though it's the tertiary reserve, it's the reserves that will be activated in the first instance. So we do rolling forecast during the day, and around half an hour before, in advance of the actual, let's say, forecasted imbalance, we will do the activation of the tertiary reserve. And if anything, if still is an imbalance, it will be taken care of by the secondary reserve.
All right, so now we're talking about the Vietnamese reserves. There are two things I will start to highlight here. Right now in Vietnam, we do not have ancillary service market yet. The second thing is the participant of the reserve of the frequency controls that all the plan have to participate in. Is requirements by grid code. As right now, we have two kinds of frequency controls of the reserves. The first thing is primary frequency control. This is we control the droop and dashband for all the hydro plants, all the coal-fired plant in the country. So all the plants have to participate is by grid code. The second thing is secondary frequency control. This one we use AGC system, is mean automatic generation control, meaning to say just from the control centers, now my company, we send the online control signal, go to all the plant. And the plant who do the secondary reserve is the big hydro plant in Vietnam. In Vietnam, we have a few hydro plants which is very big. We have now with around 15 hydro units which have run rate of 20 megawatts per second. So we just use AGC to send the control signal to them. That is what happened right now, but in the near future, together with the renewable energies integrated to the system, and together with our load right now is it's increased about 8 to 10% per year, meaning to say that after 7 to 8 years, our power system will be double. So at this moment, we cannot use hydro plants to do the reserve anymore for free anymore. Just time we need to have the market. That's why right now, me and Ulrik, we're working together to learn from Danish experience to build the market in Vietnam. So let's have a comparison between the secondary reserve from Denmark and Vietnam. The name is the difference, and for sure. For the balancing philosophy, for the Denmark, we have a market. We have two markets, as Ulrik had mentioned. In Vietnam, we do not have markets. We have AGC, we have online control to own big hydro units in the country. For characteristics, the activations of the secondary reserve in 30 seconds and activation for 5 minutes in Denmark. For Vietnam, because that's the AGC control via SCADA, so it's like about 20 seconds. And the units that the big hydro units, it can stand for very long. For capacity procurements, as I mentioned before, for the Vietnamese power markets, so Vietnamese system is about 10 times bigger than Denmark, but the size of the capacities for the secondary reserve in Vietnam is just double as Denmark. It's because of all the plants have to participate. For the primary, for the secondary, that is a big plan. Energy activations, Ulrik had mentioned, they have Biancardi system. That's very good system, the new system, which built by ZC here. And for Vietnam, we use AGC to control. The key challenge and development needs. The ancillary service market, as I mentioned with you, right now we do not have it. Primary free controls is all plant have to participate in. Secondary frequency controls, as we use large hydro plants. But the requirements for the near futures, as I mentioned with you, our power system would be get double. after 7 to 8 years, it means that we need 80 gigawatts of the generation in the near future for 7 years. As our governments have committed to have a carbon neutrality by 2050. So the load is going to increase very high, and in our master plan is that the renewable energies will go from 28% to 40 to 48% by 2030. Meaning to say, just from now until 2030, we are from 21 gigawatt of renewable energies go to about 70 gigawatt of renewable energies. I don't know how my country is going to do it, but when we have this scenario happens, starting for sure we need to build a market. That is for sure we need to learn the concept about ancillary service market. So the Danish experience that it definitely can help us, as Ulrik had mentioned. They have the market, ancillary service market from 2000 until now in 25 years. But in 2022, they have big, let's say, just upgrade. They have 2 markets, that's day-ahead markets and activation markets. And for Vietnam, so we can learn this from Denmark. We can do step by step. And the model for Vietnam, we cannot apply any models. There no one size fit all for the country. So this is why we need to learn it from Denmark. So Ulrik had mentioned about the concept about the core optimization. It means that we optimization both energy and capacity markets. This is a new concept that is maybe better for Vietnam. And to do is when our engineers have the ideas to learn about core optimization concept for the secondary reserve in Vietnam. So we have some research together. So now Ulrik going to talk about the research we have done together. Yes.
Yes, still ongoing the study, but what we compare is the 2 philosophies or 2 kind of market designs, which is the sequential market design or market setup, and the co-optimized setup. And the focus here is of course on economic efficiency evaluation. The key thing here is to procure reserves, or not only procure reserves, but do let's say a planning of your generation, day ahead energy, whatever, at a least cost, of course. That's the overall goal of the exercise, so to speak. So the question is whether a sequential market setup is the most efficient or a co-optimized. Looking at a little bit theoretically, the difference is that the sequential market setup, it clears separately from the day-ahead market. As I explained, we will procure the reserves day ahead before the day-ahead market opens and get close of day-ahead market. In terms of allocation between the different bidding zones and countries in the Nordics and Europe, we will do a forecast on how much reserves can be exchanged between the different markets. We do that based on some old day-ahead prices between the different areas. It's not perfect, but that's the way it is right now. The day-ahead price gives some kind of indication on the social value of exchanging reserves across borders. We can do that up to 10% of the interconnector between the different bidding zones can be used for reserve exchange. Why 10% is just a arbitrary value decided in Europe, so to speak. Of course, not yet. Of course, we will also respect the physical grid constraints, congestions, and so on. As I said, energy dispatch and the reserve capacity are settled and determined sequentially. What's the pros and cons of the different approaches? For the sequential setup, it's simple. It's simple to understand. It's simple to understand what's going on in terms of market functioning, in terms of results. We heard from one of the earlier presentations today, I don't recall who it was, but he said that if something goes wrong, the market participants or the customers would like to know what went wrong, and it sometimes is difficult to understand. Things might go wrong here, but in a simple market, it's easy to understand what went wrong. Simple market might also lower the barrier for entry to the market, meaning that competition might be enhanced, the competitive environment might be better. Of course, the drawback of this is theoretically at least the lack of optimization of efficiency, so to speak, because it does the sequential clearing of the markets. Meaning that when we do as TSO the procurement of reserves, we don't know exactly what the market players have in mind in terms of bidding in the day-ahead market. So if those pieces of information could be combined into a common market reserve, energy bidding, and so on, there might be something to gain here. I don't think I can take the next slide. We do have 5 minutes left. Yeah. And of course, the co-optimization is the idea of clearing the both markets simultaneously. And again, the idea is the efficiency that we're looking for, the least cost, let's say, operation of the power system. I don't think, even though it seems attractive and relevant, I'm not sure it's that relevant for Europe, because Europe is 27 countries, EU countries, plus Switzerland, Norway, UK. So a lot of countries that have to agree on something. So every time we do a change in the market designs and legislations, it's a very heavy process. So I'm not sure that the process, the effort put into the process is worth comparing with the potential benefit. I don't know. I'm not sure, but the future might prove. So let's take the next one.
All right.
Yeah. So just to give the overall picture, the high-level picture. Operational efficiency, economic efficiency, or at least cost approach might be lower in the sequential market. And of course, as Vietnam has not decided yet what to do, it's and take the decision on your own. You don't have to negotiate with 26 other countries.
Oh yeah. We have our own system.
It's highly relevant to try to dig into a co-optimization of the resources. And again, there's a complexity issue we have to look into and take into consideration. And also some infrastructure in terms of IT systems. I guess Insight can talk a lot more about that, but already these days, the algorithm for the optimization of the day-ahead market is under some pressure because there's a lot of projects, there's a lot of wishes from the different countries. In Italy, for example, we have the situation of bidding zone prices for the supply side, but one price for the demand side, the so-called PUN price. I don't recall what PUN stands for. It's an Italian abbreviation. When you have such a setup, you're also pushing and put pressure on the algorithm. And addition to that, if you'd like to co-optimize with the reserves, I think we'll put a heavy burden on Insight to come up with some kind of solution for that.
All right. I think I will skip the slide. So in order to apply the core optimization concept, as Ulrik has mentioned, we are thinking about applying it to Vietnam. But firstly, it's going to increase the market complexities. As we call optimize energy and capacity, so for sure the market is very complex. As in this case, we need very high demands on the infrastructures. The software, the hardware need to be really good. And the third thing will be, as Ulrik had mentioned, we do not have to compromise with 26 other countries. But this is a complex markets for core optimization. So we need to strong regulations which test very clear on this situation is might happen. So it's going to be a big challenge for us. And the challenge for expanding the market as for the core optimization models is going to be complex. So the participants of the market do not get clearly the benefits of the market to do for further investment. So it's a big challenge for us. So in conclusions, with 25% share of renewable energy right now, and it's going to be 40 to 48% in the next 5 years. So Vietnam, we have to build the ancillary service market. The main goals of our study together is we learn from Denmark's models, we learn from Europe models, from Nordic models about how to apply it to Vietnamese context. Core optimizations can be a good path to go, but it has a lot of challenge. So shall we go for this a lot? So recommendations for NSMO. So firstly, we need to take the technical validation, meaning to say that we need to do the simulation. To be honest with you, engineer from both sides will do the simulations for the core optimization to apply to Vietnamese context, but the simulation is too complicated and we cannot finish. So that's why I'm going to show it in this conference. The implementation roadmap. So we need to go step by step from regulation, from infrastructures, software and hardware, and also depend on the market participants. And the way to do is we're still looking to learn from Danish, as we have the TSO partnerships. Whatever issue we have, we can talk together immediately in the support of the two governments, and we can do the research together. We can come to conference together like this one. So really our study. So really looking forward to do the further design for the Vietnamese market and so also the research. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Christine Ross with MISO. I'm the lead with the Markets Research and Development team. Thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel so I can transition the topic more to the US electricity markets and give you MISO's perspective about some recent and ongoing work around regulation reserve forecasting and other reserve product enhancements. So some of the key takeaways I want you to have, if you don't remember some of the details, do remember that I think just like as many entities here, including Denmark, Vietnam, we're seeing with the energy transition towards more renewables, that we need to have reserve product enhancements in order to accommodate that and still operate the system reliably. And so also, I'll be showing you 3 different examples, and some of those product enhancements do include using AI to be able to manage uncertainty and variability. So for those of you not familiar with MISO, just give 2 introduction slides. The first more on the organization as a whole. So we're an RTO in the United States in the central part. And so we have reliability coordination responsibility for the states and province of Manitoba highlighted here. We also operate the energy and ancillary service market and other markets for the states shown here, excluding Manitoba and Canada. And so we have 3 different offices. The headquarters is outside of Indianapolis in central Indiana and Carmel, Indiana. There's also a control room there. There's 2 other regions, one in the north with a control room and an office outside of Minneapolis in Minnesota. And in the south region, there's an office in Little Rock, Arkansas. And there's various statistics here you can review on your own, just to give some information about the size of MISO in addition to the geography there. So then giving another introduction slide on the state of MISO's ancillary service and energy markets. And so it's just showing at a high level the different ancillary service products here. moving from the left with more uncertainty and further out time domain towards to the right with the operating time domain. And so you have more uncertainty, that's the cone, as you're further away from the operating time period, and that's slowly decreasing until you know what's actually going to happen in the operating time frame. So highlighting what we're showing here, furthest out time domain shown here is the next day reserve margins, that's setting days or a day ahead. Then leading into a short time frame into the short-term reserve, which is 30 minutes to 3 hours ahead. The ramp capability product, 10 minutes to 30 minutes ahead. And then moving into operating reserves, the contingency reserve for the largest unit loss was supplemental and spin. And lastly, into regulation reserve, which is 4 seconds to 5 minutes. And the energy and ancillary service markets at MISO are co-optimized, so we can cover the uncertainties across those different timeframes. And so as I mentioned in the onset, I want to tell the story about why we're doing some of this and some statistics as it relates to MISO for the energy transition with more renewable energy. So to kind of tell that story, showing some stats here for MISO's 2024 peak load, and in terms of gigawatts, as well as the percentage of the peak load that was served by different generation types on the left. And then looking forward to the different projections, we have one projection called Future 2A in the 2042 horizon, what type of generation will be serving the load at that point in time in 2042. So focusing on 2024, what that looks like for MISO as that compares with other ISOs as well. So we have a very large peak load, 123 megawatt, so 123 gigawatts, which is second to PJM. But in terms of the percentage of generation that was served by serving that load for wind and solar, we have a substantial amount for MISO, but there's more served by wind and solar in California and ERCOT. So for MISO in that 2024 peak load, we're have about 30% or so from wind and for about 10% or so from solar. And comparing that percentage wise to California and ERCOT, you can see that they do have substantially more in the 2024 timeframe. So we can learn from them on what's working well for them in their energy market structure. So then looking ahead 20 years or so to 2042, what that looks like for MISO with this projection is moving from that 30% wind at a peak to more like 50% or more wind, and moving from our 10% or so solar to 22% solar. And then another part of the energy mix I want to highlight is we do have ESRs right now. It's used in a very small capacity right now. It's not even in the 2024 figures here, but projecting to 2042, anticipating that'll be about 8% of the battery energy will be served by batteries at that time. We'll be looking for the transition, also including batteries. All right, so then moving forward, I'll touch on 3 different enhancements that we're tackling relatively recently and future work that's ongoing towards these reserve product enhancements. So the first is on uncertainty management. So I'll go over those in more detail on the next slide, just setting the stage here. So for uncertainty management, there's a whole set of products that we're developing towards that end, but I'll highlight on the work that's been done for day ahead net load, uncertainty prediction using machine learning models in a deterministic way that's used in our operational system today to set the short-term reserve requirement for the next day reserve margin. And the second topic I'll highlight on enhancements to our products is looking to dynamically determine the reserve needs. So we have an ongoing process or kind of in middle way through that, where we're looking at how to set the reserve product requirements more dynamically than what's done today, or in the past rather, and then also looking at how do we develop machine learning models or data-driven method to look at how to determine what the dynamic regulation or ramp requirements should be. And the third topic I'll touch on too is ongoing work on ancillary service deliverability, so we can make sure that reserves are delivered where they're needed. So the first topic on uncertainty management, so giving you an example here of what this process looks like, but just to describe what the process currently is. So we have a process today where we're looking at the next day risk. Is it high, medium, or low? Once we have a process that's looking at different input data to determine that risk. And so depending on that risk level is, look at the next day, we can set then the short-term reserve requirement or the next day reserve margin threshold. And this is done with my team doing an aspect of this, markets R&D, as well as our operations risk assessment team. And so what I'm showing here is an example of how that would be done, and the existing operations model that we're doing today is looking at the forecasted peak load hour. Of course, you do have forecasts every hour of the day, but that seems to be the one we want to use for our process today for the operations perspective. So looking at forecast peak load hour, do we expect that's going to be denoting a high risk? So having a very high magnitude net uncertainty, or does it have a medium type of risk depending on the standard deviation, and then the low risk? So the example shown here, we have different machine learning models that are trying to forecast what that net uncertainty would be again next day. And so we can see those across the different hours. We're making the decision though on that forecasted peak load hour. So for this example, looking back at it, how well did our models actually predict what the net uncertainty was? So I'm showing in the actual sufficiency delta, which is that net load uncertainty, was materializing the high risk. So it's below this red threshold line, which is the 2 sigma standard deviation. So denoting anything greater in magnitude than that is high risk. And so we did materialize to that. And so we can see the different models there in different colors. Some of them are not predicting that. Some of them are predicting that. So one model in this instance did accurately predict for then again, for that forecasted peak load hour, that there was high uncertainty. So this is a challenging problem for sure in the way we're trying to operate it today in this paradigm to accurately predict that. So it's a challenge to accurately predict the high risk days that materialize and not predict them where they don't materialize, and also predicting the low risk days that are actually a low risk. It's definitely a balancing act to do that. And so we can see the different machine learning models behaving better than others. Some of them perform better in different seasons. So there's more work ongoing about how to do this. So today the R&D model that we've been developing, the one that's performing better, is used to inform what that next day short-term reserve requirement and reserve margin would be. So this is an example of a deterministic way that we're using this today. So we're also doing future work to look at using a probabilistic model for this construct here to look at next day uncertainty prediction, either with a net load, forecasted peak load hour, or for potentially an hourly basis as that process continues to evolve. The second topic I wanted to cover on is on dynamically determining the reserve needs for regulation. We also have a similar process. We're looking to make a dynamic ramp requirement determination as well. For here, I'm just highlighting the regulation aspect. And so what's going on with this, we have an ongoing stakeholder discussions with this. If you're interested in more details about how we're doing this, I have a link there to the reliability subcommittee content. And this is done in conjunction with our operations risk assessment team. And so I've been looking at into late last year as well as into this year. The first way to dynamically determine the reserves is what are the key drivers for having net uncertainty for regulation. And so they have a process where they're looking at historically and also working with California and ERCOT about how to develop that process. So they've done that work. And if you're interested in details, you can go ahead and look at that. And so they're looking at different historical data to quantify what that uncertainty should be. Again, looking forward, so we're going to be operating this in the future for that regulation reserve requirement. That's that first task. The second part of this effort is then once you have the process to identify the uncertainty, how do you then derive what the regulation reserve requirement should be? So that's set on a seasonal basis. This is an example here for the summer season, and it's identifying low, medium, and high risk. And that can vary by hour as well as over the weekdays and weekend profile. So for task 2 shown here, this is an example of what that regulation requirement would look like for summer. So this is established in May, looking forward to June, July, August, what should that regulation requirement be? So this is comparing in the blue, which is our old paradigm for setting the regulation requirement. And then in the other colors, that's the monthly requirement for regulation that we looking to stand up. So you can see it has a higher magnitude in some instances. It's a little bit more variable depending on the month. And so that's a little bit of the comparison about how that changes as well. And then the third part is ongoing today. So we're looking at today, what are the key data-driven information that we can use to determine, to predict what the regulation requirement uncertainty would be. And so we'll be looking at things like the CPS real-time performance, other drivers for that with different forecasting information. And then the second part will be later into this year and likely into next year. Can we develop a machine learning model to look at what would the projected regulation uncertainty be? Some more work to come there. And a little bit of the comparison for MISO's approach for this regulation uncertainty quantification, how that compares to California and ERCOT's approach. So just at a high level, what we're using to measure that uncertainty is the BA tie error and also the reg shortage due to ramp sharing. And the other entities have slightly different variation there. And then for MISO, because we have future wind and solar generation still upcoming, we do have historical data which we can use. So we're using some information from our previous performance for the past 2 years. But we do also account for, anticipated for the next season, the growth in renewable capacity so that we can make that determination based on the future integration of more wind and solar. We also set our high and low percentiles a little bit differently than the other entities. We have a high percentage of risk set by 97th percentile, and the normal risk is the 95th percentile. That's what works best for MISO in that approach based on some cost benefit analysis with that. We're also setting these requirements on a quarterly basis. And then lastly, just touching on more framing the problem than giving you the solution, since that work is ongoing. But we know with our current construct for ancillary services, which is zonal based, where we have pricing on a nodal basis, that difference in the design can result in ancillary services that aren't delivered. So 2 different pictures to kind of tell that story. So in leftmost one, our reserve market design is zonal based. So this is aggregating really the zones in the north and central, and then showing the zones in the south. So we have these zones defined there, which don't necessarily aren't defined necessarily with the dynamic congestion that you're seeing in the second figure there. And so when there's congestion between the zones, the current construct can have deliverable reserves, but when they're within the zone, we see issues with how they're delivered. So we're doing some research on this year, and then we'll be proposing some changes next year, depending on that research, about what those future enhancements would be. So looking at if we modify the way the zones are defined, does that help improve the deliverability, or do we need to go to a more longer term solution? And also looking at the complexity in doing that. So more work to come on that. All right, that's what I wanted to share with you. Appreciate your time and attention.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Francesco Biancardi. I'm an energy market design specialist with the NYISO. I'm going to be talking to you about 2 reserve-focused initiatives that the NYISO is currently undertaking. The first is dynamic reserves. The second is balancing intermittency. So before we get into those 2 initiatives, I think it's good to do a little bit of a background check on NYISO's current rules for the reserve market. So NYISO currently procures several types of contingency reserves in its day-ahead and real-time markets to meet NYCA, it's New York Control Area, so statewide, and locational reserve requirements. So if you're not familiar with reserves, you can think of these reserve requirements as reserve targets. These targets are set via reliability rules and are relatively static. Give you an example, our current 30-minute total operating reserve target for the state is 2,620 megawatts. That is set by a reliability rule that says our markets have to procure statewide 2 times our largest operating capability loss in reserves, and our largest generator's nameplate is 1310. 1310 times 2 is 2620. And so the reason I say that these targets are static is because the nameplate rating of our largest generator is really not going to change barring construction or some kind of partial retirement, right? That number is not going to change from month to month, might not even change year from year. The NYISO's current reserve procurement and pricing methodologies also have a locational component to them, but they do not, to the fullest extent possible, reflect the locational value of reserves. So today, reserves are all priced at the zonal level, so every generator within a given zone gets the same reserve price. And we also don't really take system topology into account when we are scheduling reserves. So 1 megawatt of reserves scheduled in New York City counts as 1 megawatt towards the New York City reserve requirement, regardless of where that reserve is located. And considerations for system topology are important because the role of reserves is to make sure that in a post-contingency case, after a contingency has occurred, all of our lines are operating at or below normal operating levels. So they exist to bring the system back into equilibrium following a contingency. So you would imagine that the deliverability of a megawatt from one point to another on the system would matter in that regard. So this graphic illustrates all of the locational reserve areas that NYISO currently supports. The big blue box surrounding the whole state represents the NYCA-wide or statewide requirements. And then the gray box to the right is our Eastern Reserve region. And the Eastern Reserve region has its own set of reserve requirements. And then nested within the Eastern Reserve region is the Southeastern New York region with its own set of reserve requirements, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So 1 megawatt of reserves that we procure in Southeastern New York today counts as 1 megawatt towards the Eastern Reserve requirements. It also counts as 1 megawatt towards the statewide reserve requirements. And those three contingency reserve products that we procure today are 10-minute spinning reserves, 10-minute total reserves, 30-minute total reserves. And then we have a regulation product as well that is not considered reserve, which is why I'm not really talking about it in this presentation. So now that we've covered the basics, we could talk about how we're going to completely get rid of the basics and replace them with something much more dynamic and much more adaptable. So the NYISO's Dynamic Reserves Project was resulted from a 2021 study that we did that highlighted the need for optimization of reserve requirements, really pointed out that in a world where we have a lot of large intermittent renewables, the current static requirements are not guaranteed to always meet local or regional reliability requirements. Of course, you've heard many times today that the grid is changing. New York has, the New York State Legislature did pass a law a couple of years ago, the New York CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which sets a 70% renewable target by 2030 and targets a zero emission economy by 2040. So large intermittent renewables are kind of inevitable. And these large intermittent renewables highlight, again, static reserve requirement shortfalls. You're going to have a supply stack that's made up of a lot of very dynamic, very variable resources. And you're not going to have reserve requirements that are basically able to match that, to adapt to those changing conditions. So dynamic reserve seeks to enable the NYISO to determine the least cost generation and reserves mix to meet load based on current system conditions. And the based on current system conditions is the important part of that sentence. So what we're really doing is we're updating our optimization formulation to allow our software to determine the appropriate trade-offs between energy and reserve schedules in a constrained area utilizing transmission headroom. And we'll get into what that exactly means in the later slides. So there's four key pillars to the dynamic reserves design. Dynamic reserves is going to enable one, the dynamic determination of NYISO-wide and locational reserve requirements. Two, it's going to allow us to utilize resource shift factors in reserve scheduling and pricing, resulting in a more accurate scheduling outcome. We're going to tie local reserve requirements to local post-contingency transmission constraints. And it's going to enable the procurement of forecast reserves in the day-ahead market, so a new type of 30-minute reserve product. Ultimately, dynamic reserves is going to bring reserve scheduling more in line with energy scheduling. That is the goal. So first off, establishing dynamic NYISO-wide requirements. Dynamic NYISO-wide real-time market and day-ahead market reserve requirements will be reflective of the largest and second largest statewide supply contingency in each market interval. And so for the real-time market, that means we're going to come up with a new set of reserve requirements every 5 minutes. And in the dam, we're going to have a new set of reserve requirements for every hour of the day. So the determination of large contingency status is done by evaluating each individual resource's combined energy and ancillary service schedules, or for proxies, for external ties, by evaluating the net interchange across those interties. So a generator that has a 1,500 megawatt combined energy and ancillary services schedule would contribute, and assuming it's the largest generator in the NYISO in that interval, would contribute 1,500 megawatts towards setting the reserve requirement for that interval. The formula used to establish these requirements NYISO-wide are included on the slide here as follows. So the NYISO 30-minute total requirement that we talked about before used to be 2 times the single largest operating capability loss in the NYISO, 2,620 megawatts. It is now equal to the largest supply contingency in the NYISO, plus the second largest supply contingency in the NYISO, plus those forecast reserves I talked about earlier, and we'll expand upon on the next slide. So what that translates to is the NYISO 30-minute total requirement in every market interval is equal to the largest generator or import schedule, largest generator or net interchange schedule, the second largest generator or net interchange schedule plus forecast reserves. This approach ensures that statewide reserve targets reflect current or anticipated grid conditions in every market interval and results in a more accurate reserve procurement. So forecast reserves are a new type of reserves that are being introduced as part of dynamic reserves. These are effectuated through a series of new day-ahead market reserve constraints that will allow the NYISO to secure energy and operating reserves to the NYISO's day-ahead market forecast load. The forecast reserve constraints will, at least cost, procure additional 30-minute reserves or reserve transmission headroom to ensure sufficient energy exists in real time to serve NYISO day-ahead market forecast load. In other words, these are forecast reserves. The amount of forecast reserves procured in the day-ahead market is equal to the greater of NYISO's forecast load minus scheduled load, or zero. So anytime forecast load exceeds scheduled load of the day-ahead market, we're going to buy these extra 30-minute reserves. It's kind of an insurance policy to guard against real-time load that shows up after not getting scheduled in the day-ahead. A key aspect of the locational reserve aspect of this design is secured facilities for reserves. So we are doing away with all of the reserve regions that I spoke about on slide 4 in that giant graphic. And we are instead going to be scheduling reserves to secure individual transmission elements on the grid for post-contingency conditions. So we're initially going to model a bunch of transmission lines, which make up key interfaces across the NYICA, and those lines that factored into the definition of the existing reserve areas on which the post-contingency power flows will be modeled and managed using new locational operating reserve constraints. I'll talk a little bit about what those LORCs are in a little bit. But what this does is it allows us to ensure that whatever reserves we buy are actually going to be able to restore the system to normal following a contingency. Right? We know we have enough reserves from generators A, B, and C to reduce flows on line X back to normal should a contingency occur. What enables us to do this, or really a part of what enables us to do this, is the utilization of resource shift factors. So for those that don't know, a shift factor is a number between -1 and 1 that measures the impact that 1 megawatt of generation from a given generator will have on flows across a line somewhere in the system. So you might have Gen A in Queens, New York, that has a -0.5 shift factor on a line in Westchester County, New York, which is north of New York City, and it might have a 1.0 shift factor on a closer line. Negative numbers indicate that 1 megawatt of generation reduces flows across the transmission element, and a positive shift factor indicates that energy from that generator would have an additive impact on flows across that transmission element. So for that said, how does that help us in coming up with a more accurate set or a more helpful set of reserve schedules? Utilizing resource shift factors for reserve scheduling allows the optimization to better predict the impact of post-contingency reserve deployment on post-contingency flows across the transmission facilities that we're going to be securing under dynamic reserves. So you now have a measure or a predictive measure of how effective your generator actually is at solving post-contingency transmission constraints, and then how valuable they are as a reserve provider. Ultimately, this means the optimization will schedule more reserves on resources whose shift factors show that they are more effective in addressing specific post-contingency constraints than in those generators that are not. The utilization of resource shift factors also enables us to implement a new nodal reserve price. So we're superseding the zonal reserve price with a new locational marginal operating reserve price, or LMORP. The LMORP is comprised of 2 components: a marginal statewide reserves price component and a reserves congestion component. And this brings it more in line. This brings reserve pricing more in line with our energy locational based marginal price, which is similar, but has some other components. So the great thing about the LMORP is that it better reflects the locational value of a generator's reserves compared to zonal pricing, which is going to result in more efficient market outcomes. Now, not every generator in New York City is going to get the same reserves price. A generator, I don't mean to keep picking on Queens, but a generator in Queens might get a higher reserve price than a generator in Midtown Manhattan or something like that, which again allows the optimization to more effectively and efficiently schedule reserves. So the last thing I'm going to talk about regarding dynamic reserves is those locational operating reserve constraints that I talked about earlier, or LORCs. And this is really the linchpin that holds together all of the dynamic locational requirements portion of the dynamic reserves design. So we're going to integrate these LORCs into our day-ahead market and real-time optimization models that determine local reserve requirements to meet reliability criteria following N-1 and N-1 contingencies. So for those that aren't familiar with the vernacular, an N-1 contingency is the loss of 1 generator or 1 transmission line. N-1 is the loss of 2 generators, 2 lines, or 1 line and 1 generator. So it's the unexpected outage of a generator or a line, something that's going to impact system topology and network flows. So the solving of these locational operating reserve constraints will yield a set of reserve schedules that ensure post-contingency flows across all secure transmission facilities will respect that facility's post-contingency limits and overload timing requirements, considering energy supplier, reserve supplier, and load shift factors and schedules. So these are all, to put it as simply as I can, these are all set up as inequalities. So line limit has to be less than or equal to energy schedules plus load schedules minus reserve schedules. And so when we're scheduling reserves, we're going to be looking for reserves that have negative shift factors because we want them to reduce flows on the lines that we're securing. So that brings me to balancing intermittency. So balancing intermittency is another reserve-focused project that the NYISO is currently pursuing. While dynamic reserves is more focused on updating or modernizing the contingency reserve procurement process, balancing intermittency is focused on addressing forecast uncertainty in renewables and load. So under balancing intermittency, NYISO is proposing to procure through its day-ahead market and real-time markets operating reserves that address these forecast uncertainties when they occur and where they occur. So this design is going to yield a new set of uncertainty reserve requirements. These uncertainty reserve requirements will be additive with the existing contingency reserve requirements we have to deal with forecast uncertainties for every hour of the day for the day-ahead market and real-time markets, and for every reserve region for the day-ahead market run. So you notice under dynamic reserves, I said we're getting rid of the reserve region framework. And here, balancing intermittency references it. It's because both projects were being developed at the same time. And so a lot of the work we're doing now is figuring out how we can combine these two designs into one seamless reserve design. So the components of the uncertainty reserve requirements are net load, land-based wind, offshore wind, and front-of-the-meter solar forecasts. So very similar to some of the stuff that's going on in ERCOT, MISO, and CAISO currently. So how do these things all fit together? The goal, like I mentioned at the top, was to create a more robust, more adaptable reserve procurement process that better prepositions the NYISO to handle large intermittent renewables coming onto the system. These designs do this by first, dynamic reserves creates a more adaptable contingency reserve procurement and sizing process that will reflect changing system conditions throughout the operating day in each day-ahead market and real-time market interval. Dynamic reserves is also creating new forecast reserves, which modify the NYICA-wide 30-minute total reserve requirement when forecast load exceeds scheduled load in the dam. So insurance against real-time load that shows up without getting scheduled in the day ahead. And balancing intermittency will result in the procurement of additional contingency reserves called uncertainty reserves in the day-ahead market and real-time market to account for load and intermittent renewable forecast errors. So altogether, again, better prepositioning us to handle all of these large renewables coming onto the system. That's all I had. Thanks again, folks. Passing on to the next presenter.
So, hello, everyone. There's an appendix. Do we want to go through the appendix? So you guys have additional resources, but now we talk about reserve dimensioning. Well, really happy to be here. My name is Giancarlo. I work at Inside. Maybe a little disclaimer before I start. I'm not going to be taking too much time. I see that I don't have too much. And of course, it's tough to summarize the way that we do things in Europe in a very condensed time. I believe you guys have done it quite well from the previous presentation. So of course, keep any question that you might have and any clarification for later on. I will be very, very happy to address them. And apologies in case indeed, like I go quite fast on some items. Work at Inside, which is not an ISO. We are a software provider, and we actually collaborate with the main actors in the European energy landscape. So this is a map of the world, and I'm not telling you anything surprising, I guess. So in Europe, we actually divided the responsibility that you guys have on the ISO side into two different types of entities. We have the power exchanges, which are responsible for the financial market, the financial side of things. And then we have the system operators, which are instead in charge of keeping the lights on and making sure that the physics still adds up at the end of the day. Inside, as it was mentioned before, we work in the development. We have been working for the last 11 years in the development of Eufemia, which is the algorithm that is used in order to operate the day ahead and the intraday energy markets in Europe. This basically means that those 27 countries, which were mentioned before, needed to agree on something, right? At a certain point, they agreed on this one. So this has been like one of the main activities, but we're also active on basically like the ISO side of things, what we call TSOs, transmission system operators, and we support them on the balancing market, both on the design and the clearing phase. I have to go through that marketing introduction just also to make you understand what do we do. But I will skip the different projects and I will go directly into what can be a little introduction of how balancing works in Europe. So we have two different phases related to balancing. The first one is really about the procurement of balancing capacity. Here we talk about power, megawatts, and this mainly works on long-term ahead. This can happen like months ahead where we secure balancing capacity, up actually to the day ahead, where there are several auctions which run in order to make sure that the system operator has enough balancing capacity in order to cover their potential needs. Once that this phase is computed and is completed, then we pass to the second phase, which is related to the balancing activation. This is instead about the energy itself, is a close to real-time auction. And what we do basically is we make sure that the reserves which were guaranteed on the day-ahead market are actually activated depending on the real physical situation of the system. For the balancing, for the first part, the balancing activation is where I'm going to be going more in detail later on in the presentation. One thing that I want to mention on the balancing activation part, so like the energy component, is that we have several initiatives. One of them was mentioned before, which is the Picasso initiative. We have several projects which are really like trying to bring together the different European countries and activate reserves in a, let's say, like joint way, which is a really nice way that we are improving on that. So let's describe the different type of reserves. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary reserves. Starting from the primary, we call that frequency containment reserve. This is really necessary in order to somehow make sure that you do not have blackouts. It's the reserve that we apply in order to compensate for larger imbalances. It's rough, it's not precise. It's really about basically bringing the value closer to our system frequency. The second component is the frequency restoration reserve, and it's split into two different products: the automatic frequency restoration reserve and the manual frequency restoration reserve, with the acronyms AFRR, MFRR. I didn't touch on the response time of them, so we know that the automatic frequency restoration reserve implies that your system gets to its, let's say, full activation within 5 minutes. For the manual frequency restoration reserve, these are around 12.5 minutes. Lastly, we have the replacement reserve, which is slower reserves. They are not actually so present in many countries in Europe. They're kind of a legacy product, I would say. And the way, as you know, today I want to talk about sizing of these reserves. So the way that these reserves are sized is also different across the different countries. For FCR, this is sized at a European level. So there is an amount of frequency containment reserve, and it's proportional to the peak load of each individual country. Basically, what we do is that we look what is the peak load of Germany, France, Denmark, Italy, and depending on that, we provide them a share of this FCR. In a different way, instead, the FRR, so this frequency restoration reserve in both its component, is dimensioned by each individual country. And that's the interesting thing. That's actually what we want to deep dive on today. Usually, these frequency restoration reserves are sized in a static way. So what we do, Frankie just mentioned this N-1 criterion. We also apply that in Europe. We try to see what could be the impact of losing your largest generator, or as you know, Europe is quite interconnected, so often this coincides into being the largest interconnector with your neighboring country, and you still make sure that you're keeping the lights on. In order to do that, you apply this N-1 criterion considering the largest imbalances in the past years. You look at different locational components because, well, if you have all your reserves in a specific area of the country, you don't have enough interconnection capacity, it's not so useful to actually have them. You cannot really activate them. You consider the schedules of the upcoming days also to know what are the other commitments of the assets, because we have a self-dispatch system, not a central dispatch. And this is a process which is highly regulated by what we call the SOGL, the System Operation Guidelines. Other regulations also fall in the EBGL, European Balancing Guidelines, basically a bunch of rules that tells us how we have to size these reserves. And this static approach is expensive, of course. It has been in place for a long time and is secure. However, as you all know, the world is significantly changing. So you can assume that you have a system. I bring you in this hypothetical world where you have a system with a high penetration of wind. Well, it's beautiful, renewables, we all like that. However, when there is a lack of wind in a given area, This is causing a significant error in your forecast. You are able, if you have good forecast, and I think that here, this is all about forecasting, right? If you have good forecast, of course, you're able to anticipate that, but you are not actually considering it inside of your static dimensioning approach. And that would mean that your system is not prepared to have enough reserves in this scenario, or would have to actually imply an over-procurement of reserves. That's why more and more countries in Europe are moving towards a more dynamic dimensioning approach. This is really about the renewable energy sources, as I was mentioning, the flows of interconnector and neighboring regions, because in the moment that you have a lot of wind in a country in Central Western Europe, most likely, we're not so large as in the US, you're gonna be having a lot of wind also in the neighboring countries. So in the same way that you have this problem, all the neighboring countries will have it as well. In order to consider all these different factors, then you know that you need to procure differently depending on where are different uncertainties. In the static dimensioning approach, what the operator usually does is simply he finds what is the worst case scenario throughout the year. He identifies the power that is needed in that moment, and he pads it across the different time units that he has for the entire year. But it makes sense to actually procure more when you have a higher uncertainty and less when you have a lower uncertainty, right? I know it sounds trivial, but it's not always applied. That's basically the principle behind this dynamic sizing, using your data, using intelligence about the system needs in order to better optimize this procurement. So the way that we do that is that we have a first element about capturing the impact of the system condition. We mentioned it, the main sources of uncertainty here are the renewable generation, the interconnector flows from the neighboring countries, and your load, your demand. You do that through a probabilistic forecast. On the other side, you generate several Monte Carlo simulations to model what are the impactful rare events. And we talked about that. What happens if I'm losing my largest interconnector or my largest power plant? You then apply a convolution on those, and as a post-processing step through the probabilistic distribution that results after this convolution, you then apply this N-1 criterion. And this is basically just saying that like this has been applied at several system operators, and it maintains this N-1 security, reducing procurement costs and increasing the efficiency. So how would that look like? Basically, you obtain something like this. This image is generated by ChatGPT. Don't try to infer which one is the country which has this like this type of profile. I needed to of course anonymize it. But the reasoning behind it is that the static approach, as I was mentioning, go for your upward and downward reserve, basically like increasing or decreasing your reserve. You would look at what is the maximum basically power that you need in megawatt, and you would pad that throughout the year. So it would be the same value for different hourly blocks. With a dynamic approach, you try to reduce the granularity of the time frame, and you try to look actually at what is the specific need that you have in that moment. A clear example that usually I use is that you don't have uncertainty about solar generation by night, right? So like that shouldn't be a component that you consider. That basically allows you to look more towards the future and make sure that you cover the imbalances in the forecasted upcoming period and not really focusing on the past one. So if there are 4 takeaways that I have on this dynamic dimensioning approach, looking at the future, not focusing on the past, understanding what are the drivers of the uncertainty through that convolution process that I was mentioning, focusing on having a higher granularity, not just padding the same number throughout the entire year, and lowering the cost for having a better utilization of the system. So of course, if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them now, or you can contact me when I'm back in Europe. Thank you.